All right, strap in, everyone. Let's dive deep into a story from Bethel, Ohio. This one really puts the spotlight on just how complex things get when mental health and law enforcement meet, you know?
Yeah, it's a tough one.
We're talking about a situation involving a police officer and a man named Jeff. Big guy, 6'5",
Yeah.
300 pounds, maybe having a mental episode.
Not your average call, right?
Definitely not. And get this, we've got body cam footage.
Yeah.
So we're not just, speculating. We're going right to the source.
It's going to be revealing, to say the least.
For sure. Now, Jeff ends up facing 3 charges: assault, resisting arrest, and obstructing official business. Pretty heavy stuff.
Those are serious accusations, each with its own legal definitions and implications. We're talking about the Ohio Revised Code here.
Right. So let's break those down a bit. What does Ohio law actually say about these charges? Starting with assault, I guess.
Okay, so assault in Ohio, basically it means, you knowingly cause or attempt to cause physical harm to someone else.
Knowingly.
Yeah, that's the key word. But that's where things get tricky in this case. I mean, if Jeff was in the middle of a mental episode, how do you determine if he knowingly caused harm?
Yeah, it's not always black and white, is it? Like, the law wants clear-cut definitions, but mental health crises, they don't always fit neatly in those boxes.
Exactly.
What about resisting arrest? What does that look like, legally speaking?
Well, in Ohio, resisting arrest means you forcibly or recklessly resist a lawful arrest.
But again, if someone's in a mental health crisis, can you really say their actions are reckless or forcible in the eyes of the law?
It definitely raises questions about, intent and all that.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And then you've got obstructing official business. What's that all about?
Basically, it means you're preventing a public official from doing their job.
Like interfering with the officer, right?
Yeah.
But how much of that interference is intentional when someone's in a mental state like that? It's not always a conscious choice.
That's the gray area we're dealing with here. The law, it might not capture the nuances of someone's mental state during an episode like that.
So we're seeing how those strict legal definitions, they kind of start to break down when you apply them to this situation, right?
It's a tough puzzle to solve.
But the law still needs some kind of framework to work within. How does this case navigate those different levels of evidence?
That's where things get really interesting. You see, it's like a step-by-step process, moving from the lowest level, which is mere suspicion, all the way up to beyond a reasonable doubt.
Oh, I like that. Like climbing a legal ladder, each rung with a higher standard of proof.
Exactly. And using Jeff's case, we can walk through those steps.
Awesome. Lead the way.
All right, so at the very beginning, you have mere suspicion. It's based on the officer's initial observations. Things like Jeff's size, his behavior, and even what his girlfriend said about a possible mental episode.
Right. So the officer's noticing something isn't quite right, but it's not enough to make an arrest just yet.
Uh-huh. It's enough to justify further investigation, but that's all.
Gotcha. So what's the next step up on that ladder?
Okay, next up is reasonable suspicion.
Reasonable suspicion.
This requires a bit more concrete evidence, suggesting that, a crime might have actually been committed.
So we're talking about what, like Jeff's actions, witness statements, anything like that?
Exactly. And here's where the body cam footage really comes into play.
Right. Because now you've got visual evidence. You can actually see how Jeff's behaving and interacting with the officer.
Exactly.
Okay. So based on that footage, the officer might then decide if there's probable cause.
Right, meaning there's enough evidence to believe a specific crime's been committed, which justifies an arrest.
Makes sense? So we've gone from suspicion to justification for an arrest. But what about actually proving the case in court?
Now for that you need an even higher standard of proof.
Higher than probable cause.
Yes. In a civil case, like if we're talking about personal injury or something, you need to demonstrate what's called a preponderance of the evidence.
Preponderance of the evidence. Meaning
it's more likely than not that the defendant caused harm. For example, if the officer was injured during the encounter, proving Jeff caused those injuries would fall under this standard.
Okay, I'm following. But what about the criminal charges? Those seem like they'd require an even tougher standard to clear.
Absolutely. For a conviction in a criminal case, you need to prove guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. That's the highest standard of proof we have. Near certainty of guilt. And, this is where things get even more complicated when mental health is a factor.
Because now it's not just about proving what happened, it's about understanding why. Right.
Yeah.
And that why is heavily influenced by Jeff's mental state during the whole encounter.
Exactly.
So if the defense argues that Jeff was having a mental episode, They might need to prove that clearly and convincingly.
Right. They'd need to demonstrate that his actions were a result of his mental state, not some criminal intent.
Okay, so we've got this whole spectrum of evidence, each level with a different burden of proof. But I'm curious, how does the body cam footage actually factor into all of this? Can we pinpoint specific moments that might be crucial to the case?
That's a great question. You know, the camera, it only sees what's in front of it, right? It can't see what's going on inside someone's head.
Right, right.
But even still, it can reveal a lot, you know?
I see where you're going with this.
Like, let's say the footage shows Jeff saying things that don't make sense, or he seems disoriented.
Right, right.
Or maybe he reacts in ways that don't match up with what the officer's telling him to do. Those could be signs of a mental health episode.
It's like trying to read between the lines, right? The footage itself might not scream mental episode, but it could have these little clues that support that argument.
Exactly. And those visual cues can be pretty powerful, especially when you combine them with expert testimony.
Okay, let's talk about that. How does expert testimony fit into a case like this one?
All right, picture this. You've got a jury, and they may not know that much about mental health conditions.
Okay, yeah.
They're watching this footage, trying to make sense of what Jeff's doing. And that's when psychologist or psychiatrist can step in and provide some really important context.
Right.
They can explain how certain mental health conditions might show up in a person's actions and reactions.
So they're helping the jury see Jeff's behavior through a different lens.
Exactly. Think of the John Hinckley Jr. case. He was found not guilty by reason of insanity using a diminished capacity defense. It's a very rare thing, but it shows how the legal system tries to deal with mental illness.
Those cases are definitely outliers, but they highlight how much weight expert testimony has, especially in cases where mental health is a big factor.
Yeah, for sure.
Okay, but let's shift gears a bit. This whole situation also raises questions about how law enforcement officers are trained to handle these kinds of mental health crises, doesn't it?
Oh, absolutely. The body cam footage can be really useful for evaluating how the officer responded. You know, did they try to de-escalate the situation?
Right.
Did they try to communicate with Jeff in a way that acknowledged he might be having a mental episode? Did they have the resources and the training to handle this safely?
Yeah, that's a key point. When we look at this footage, it's clear that even officers with the best intentions, they might not have the tools they need to deal with a mental health crisis effectively.
It's true.
It's kind of like expecting a plumber to perform surgery, right? They both work with important systems, but their expertise is in completely different areas.
I like that analogy. It really highlights how important it is for law enforcement to have better training in crisis intervention, you know?
Right.
Imagine a world where officers are trained not just to react and control, but also to understand, de-escalate, and connect people with the help they need.
So it's about giving them a whole new set of tools,
Yeah.
right? Equipping them with the skills and knowledge to approach these situations with more empathy and effectiveness.
Exactly. And that shift in approach could actually help prevent these situations from getting violent or leading to unnecessary arrests.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
It's about recognizing that sometimes the best response isn't a criminal charge, but a compassionate intervention.
Right, right.
Absolutely.
It seems like so much of this comes down to acknowledging that law enforcement has limits when it comes to dealing with mental health, right?
Yeah.
They're often the first ones on the scene, but they're not always equipped to handle how complex a mental health crisis can be.
That's a really good point, and that's why this case is so important for learning. You know, it makes us ask those tough questions. What kind of training do our officers need?
Exactly.
What resources are available to help people in crisis?
Yeah.
How can we build a system that puts both safety and compassion first?
We've talked a lot about the role of law enforcement, but what about mental health professionals? It seems like their expertise would be crucial in assessing these situations and providing support on the scene.
Oh, absolutely. I think mobile crisis response teams are a game changer here. You know, these teams have mental health professionals who can respond directly to crises, often working alongside law enforcement.
So instead of sending just an officer who's mainly trained in law enforcement tactics, you have someone there who's trained to de-escalate and assess the situation from a mental health standpoint.
Right. It's about having the right expertise at the right time.
And are these teams proving to be effective?
Incredibly so. They can de-escalate situations, connect people with the services they need, and often prevent the need for arrests or hospitalization. It's a win for everyone involved.
It sounds like we're moving towards a more well-rounded approach to public safety, one that understands how mental health and the justice system are intertwined.
That's exactly what we need. And it's not just about these specialized teams. There's also the co-responder model, where a mental health professional is paired with an officer to respond to calls where mental health might be a factor.
Oh, interesting. So you've got a built-in mental health consultant right there with the officer.
Precisely. The mental health professional can do an on-the-spot assessment, help with de-escalation, and guide the officer on the best way to interact with the person in crisis. It's all about teamwork and using everyone's strengths to get the best outcome.
Okay, so these new approaches are encouraging, but what about the bigger picture? What systemic changes need to happen to really tackle this problem at its root? It feels huge. Where do we even start?
Yeah, it's a huge issue, right?
It feels kind of overwhelming, to be honest. Like, we're talking about funding, training, the stigma surrounding mental health, access to care. Where do you even begin to untangle all of that?
I hear you. It's complex. There's no easy fix. But one of the most powerful things we can do, I think, is change how we talk about mental health.
You're talking about the stigma.
Exactly. For too long, it's been this thing we keep in the shadows, you know?
Yeah.
All hush-hush.
And that makes it so much harder for people to ask for help.
Right. And it makes it harder for communities to, actually put resources towards mental health.
So what do we do? How do we change that?
We got to start being open and honest about mental health. Treat it as seriously as we treat physical health.
I like that.
Imagine if it was just as normal to talk about going to therapy as it is to talk about going to the doctor.
It's about normalizing it, making it okay to admit you're struggling.
Exactly. And that starts with all of us, in our families, at work, in our communities.
We have to be willing to have those tough conversations.
Yeah.
To challenge those old-fashioned views.
Yeah. And, we need to advocate for better policies. Policies that prioritize mental health care, that fund those crisis response teams we talked about, that make sure people can actually access affordable treatment.
We have to make our voices heard, right?
Absolutely. Demand better from our leaders. It's like that saying, be the change you want to see.
Yeah, it starts with each of us, but it needs to lead to bigger changes in the system.
Right. And those individual actions, they can be small things, like learning more about mental health, supporting organizations that are doing good work, or even just, really listening when someone shares their struggles.
It's about creating that ripple effect. Every conversation, every bit of support, every step towards understanding, it all chips away at that stigma.
Yeah. And it helps us build a more compassionate, more just approach to mental health. This Bear of Bethel case, it might be about one town and one encounter, but it really reflects this bigger issue.
It makes us face some uncomfortable truths about how we as a society respond to mental health crises.
But it also gives us some hope, right?
Yeah, because it started this conversation. It's pushing us to look at our systems, demand better, and imagine a future where justice and compassion aren't at odds with each other.
Exactly. And that's why I think these deep dives are so valuable. You take a single event, break it down, and use it to explore these bigger societal issues.
It's about connecting the dots.
Yeah.
Challenging what we think we know.
And ultimately, I think it's about empowering ourselves to be part of the solution.
We've covered so much ground today, from the legal details of the case to the wider implications for mental health and law enforcement. It's been a tough conversation, but really eye-opening.
It has, hasn't it?
And this conversation needs to keep going. These issues, they deserve our attention. We can't let them fade into the background.
We got to keep pushing for progress on every level.
Thank you for joining us for this deep dive. We hope you're walking away with a better grasp of just how complex this issue is. But more importantly, we hope you're leaving with a sense of hope and a sense that you can make a difference. Remember, every voice matters, every action counts, and together we can build a world where everyone feels safe, supported, and valued.